You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. So today we're going to talk about the role of exercise in overweight and obesity. So I know we've had this conversation before, but there's so many various exercises. I really wanted to kind of look into the data and see what is the best option. So today's podcast is going to be relatively short, but I think it'll be super informative in terms of letting everybody know kind of one, what the options are, and two, really what is the best option and maybe why it's better than some of the others. So I've looked at multiple articles, but probably the most beneficial article that I looked at was one published in the journal Circulation, Cardiovascular Quality and Outcomes by a host of authors led by Petrokoulis. This was an original paper titled Comparative Efficacy of 5 Exercise Types on Cardiometabolic Health in Overweight and Obese Adults, a systematic review and network meta-analysis of 81 randomized controlled trials. And I know that sounds like a total snoozer and you're probably wanting to hit skip right now, but let's just go into it. We'll make it brief. So basically, they did a network meta-analysis, or an NMA, and they ended up with 81 randomized controlled trials. Now remember, randomized controlled trials are really the gold standard of all studies in science. And so the way they got to this was they did a Medline search where they looked at all the published data that basically dealt with this topic. And when they did that, they found 5,492 articles. And then when they really went through them, about half of those were duplicates, so those were removed. And then that left 3,234 articles left. So they went in and screened them, and they excluded a lot of those just by title or the abstract, which is just kind of the brief little synopsis of the study. And that got that down to 2,925. And then they looked at the full text articles and assessed for eligibility. A lot of these were excluded for various reasons. The population was either too big, too small, or not representative of the demographic. The intervention or the type of study, the intervention or the outcomes that they were looking at. There was a requirement that the studies were published in English, and 3 of these were not, so those were excluded. There were 48 studies that when they looked at closer were found not to be randomized controlled trials. Then there were 16 that when they looked at them closer, they were simply reviews. Then they scoured additional articles and identified 24 that they put back in. So in the end, they found a total of 81 studies that were included for qualitative synthesis. And basically, they just went in and did a network meta-analysis of the data of all these studies. So the background of this study reads as this. Although regular exercise is recommended for preventing and treating overweight and obesity, the most effective exercise type for improving cardiometabolic health in individuals with overweight and obesity remains largely undecided. This network meta-analysis aimed to evaluate and rank the comparative efficacy of 5 exercise modalities on cardiometabolic health measures in individuals with overweight and obesity. So what they did was they looked at these 81 studies, and they basically looked at the different exercise programs, and they had multiple endpoints where they were trying to determine which forms of exercise provided the best overall improvement. So let's look at the various parameters they look at, and they're numerous. So I just want you to listen to all of them that they looked at. And then in the end, they went through and just combined all the data and came up with a conclusion. So the endpoints that they were looking at in part were body mass, body fat percentage, free fat mass, the body mass index, the waist circumference, the waist to hip ratio, triglyceride level, total cholesterol level, high density lipoprotein or, HDL, the good cholesterol, as well as low density lipoprotein or LDL. They looked at fasting glucose, fasting insulin, the homeostatic model assessment for insulin resistance, which is criteria that's used commonly in assessing diabetics, the hemoglobin A1C, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, the mean arterial pressure, resting heart rate, cardiorespiratory fitness measured primarily by VO2 max, upper body strength, and lower body strength. That's a lot of parameters, but it gives you a good idea of what they're looking at, right? They're looking at cardiovascular fitness. They're looking at some structural strength fitness with the upper body mass index. They're looking at physiologic parameters like the cholesterol levels. And so it's a good overview. And not all of the studies necessarily looked at every single component of this, but globally they looked to see which of the different programs provided the best form of exercise. Now, let's go back to when we've talked about the recommendations for exercise. the current recommendations are that we exercise 150 to 300 minutes of moderate physical activity per week, or 75 to 150 minutes of intense exercise. Plus, in addition to that, there should be 2 to 3 bouts of resistance training throughout the week as well. Those are the current recommendations, and those are not necessarily that easy to do. And as you remember, when we've talked in the previous podcasts, we talked about how little weight is actually lost through exercise alone, right? The majority of weight loss occurs with the diet. Although we do look at some of the parameters associated with weight loss, this isn't a study to tell you what is the most effective exercise for weight loss. It's really to look at these other parameters. So what are the different types of exercise that we're talking about? There are 5 types. The first type is the continuous endurance training. That's intensity where you exercise to a maximum heart rate of greater than 65%. Typically, these are about 30 to 60 minute sessions, and you do about 3 to 5 per week. So what are some examples of that? Any sort of continuous traditional aerobic training. So running would be the one that comes to mind for most people. Cycling, even walking, swimming, aerobics, elliptical, step elliptical. Any of those are examples of continuous endurance training. So the second type is interval training. So interval training is like HIIT. You hear about HIIT, high intensity interval training, but there's also MIT, so moderate intensity interval training. And that's sort of any intermittent traditional form of training. So what is intermittent training? Well, it's any traditional mode of training, kind of like the continuous endurance training, such as running, biking, rowing, etc. And it's always a single component. So it's just walking, or it's just running, or it's just cycling. And then what you do is you do it hard for a period of time. So let's just say you go really intense for 60 seconds, and then you back off for 30 seconds or another 60 seconds or a minute, and then you go hard again. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a minute and a minute. The times can vary. The Norwegian 4x4s are sort of an example of high intensity training. And typically your heart rate is greater than 75% of its maximum. Usually these exercises are much shorter. So these exercise times tend to be around 20 to 30 minutes, and you do those about 2 to 3 times a week. So they're much more efficient in terms of time. So the third type of training is resistance training. And it's just your typical, weightlifting is what you would typically think of that. It's any mode of training where you're working against resistance. So that could be like a circuit training like you'd see in a gym where you go from machine to machine. You could go do free weights. You could even do resistance band. And with resistance training, you don't go off of heart rate so much, but rather your 1 rep max. So what is 1 rep max? Well, 1 rep max, let's just say bench press is the exercise that you're going to do. That's a form of resistance training. And what you would do is you would kind of warm up, and then with a spotter, you would try to figure out what the maximum amount of weight you can lift one time. So whatever that weight is, if you can lift it twice, that's not your 1 rep max. It's the amount of weight that you can lift one time. You can lift it off the machine down to your chest and back up. But it doesn't have to be a bench press. It could be a squat. It could be a clean and jerk. It could be any of those. Or it could be also on machines or resistance band. But it's just the maximum amount of weight you can do one time. So that's your 1 rep max. So when you're doing resistance training, you want to do it at about half of your 1 rep max, or at least half or more of your 1 rep max, depending on kind of the goal. Now, the fourth type of training is what we call combination training. So it's just that. It's a combination of continuous endurance training and resistance training. However, they're done in separate portions of the same session. And that's important because it's going to be different from hybrid training that we're going to talk about in a minute. So in combination training, what you do is you go to the gym, and let's say you get on the treadmill and you run for 30 minutes. And then you leave the treadmill, you go over to the weight section, and you do resistance training for another 30 minutes. It's 2 separate forms of exercise, all performed in the same session. Now, the fifth type of training is what's called hybrid training. And it's different than combination training in that the 2 forms of exercise are intermixed. So you would do sort of an intermittent multi-component exercise where you do treadmill, say for 60 seconds, then you jump off and lift weights. Then you go back to the treadmill and then jump off and lift weights. Or maybe on a stationary bike and then jump off and do kettlebells, right? You're doing resistance training and continuous endurance training, or sort of cardiovascular training but they're intermixed between the two. And examples of that would be like CrossFit or Orange Theory or High Rocks. Those are all examples of hybrid training. And again, that's similar but different than combination training, because in combination training, you do both of those, but you do them separately. You start and complete the cardiovascular part, the treadmill or the stationary bike or the regular bike or whatever. You do that for 30 minutes, then you get off and you lift weights. That's combination. Hybrid is where they're intermixed. And with hybrid training, that's typically high heart rate, greater than 75% of your max, and usually done for 30 to 45 minutes per session, oftentimes 2 to 3 times a week. So those are the 5 types of exercise: continuous endurance training, interval training, resistance training, combination training, and hybrid training. So we talked about the 5 types of training, and we have all those different parameters, but I'm going to break those parameters down really into 5 broad categories. One is body composition, one is blood lipids, one is glycemic control, one is blood pressure, and one is cardiorespiratory fitness. Each of those represents a different benefit to overall health, but all of them are important. But then I just want to talk about which form of exercise provided the best outcomes in each of those different subsets. So for body composition, the best form of exercise was combination therapy. And second was hybrid training, followed third with continuous endurance training. For blood lipids, for control of your LDL, cholesterol, and HDL, the best option was continuous training, followed by the second best being hybrid training, and third, interval training. For glycemic control, in cases of diabetes or prediabetes, the best form of exercise was combination training, followed second by hybrid, and third by interval training. For blood pressure control, the best form of exercise was combination therapy, followed second by hybrid training, followed third by resistance training. And lastly, for cardiorespiratory fitness, the best form of exercise was combination training, followed by hybrid training, followed by interval training. So as you can tell, on all 5 of these components, the best option was combination training. And in all 5 of these, the second best option was hybrid training. It's interesting because continuous endurance training is oftentimes what people end up doing. When you make a goal to lose weight, a lot of times people decide they need to start walking, to get on the treadmill, to start running, to start biking. And all of those are excellent. And I don't discourage any of those. But in terms of weight loss, in terms of body composition, blood lipids, glycemic control, blood pressure control, or cardiorespiratory fitness, that alone is not as effective. The other thing that people tend to do is they join gyms, right? Look at the gym membership in late December, early January. Everybody goes out and joins the gym. And the gym is primarily a place where you do some of the continuous endurance training on the treadmills, on the stationary bikes, etc., but also you're lifting weights. If you're just doing either one of those, you're not getting the maximum amount of benefit. Where you get the maximum amount of benefit is when you do both of them, right? And you do both of them in separate sessions. In other words, it's generally recommended that you're doing it in the same trip to the gym, so to speak, right? You go and you get on the treadmill for X number of minutes, and then you get on the weights after that. But it's separate, as opposed to hybrid, where, like I said, they're interwoven in between each other. You do one for a few minutes, and then you jump right to the other. And that's usually a set program. But combination training and hybrid training are very similar. And when you look at these 5 parameters, body composition, blood lipids, glycemic control, blood pressure, and cardiorespiratory fitness, you see that they are 1 and 2 in every single one of them. So continuous endurance training on its own, interval training, resistance training, all of those are excellent. I'm not discouraging any form of exercise. If you're getting some, it's great. But at the end of the day, the question always comes is, what is the best way to exercise? And you can get online and you can find any opinion you want. You can have people tell you that resistance training is the only way to go, or that endurance training is the only way to go. And so the nice thing about a study like this is it just looks at it scientifically. It just looks at the data. This is a well put together study. It's not biased. There's really nothing in it for any of these people. It's not funded in such a way where it's leaning toward one or the other outcomes. There's really no financial gain to be had throughout this. So it's an excellent study. It really helps us to look at what the options are. Now, what is the downside to combination training? The combination of doing continuous endurance training for a while and then going to resistance training all in the same session. Well, the biggest drawback to it is that it's time consuming. It kind of tends to be the longest of all of the ways to train. The hybrid training is nice in that it provides very similar benefits, but in a much more efficient way. Now, of course, you get your heart rate up a little higher with hybrid training. The heart rate there is generally to get your heart rate up to around 75 to 80% of its maximum number, as opposed to in the continuous training, you're looking to get it up to around 65%. Now, why is it that running your heart rate at 65% or sort of in that zone 2 area is more beneficial? Well, we know that fat is burned better in zone 2 than, say, zone 3, 4, or 5. These zones that I'm referencing are your heart rate zones. So you figure out your maximum heart rate and you just plug that in. You can go to any online calculator and put in your maximum heart rate and it'll break it down into your zones. It'll have to do with your age and your sex and it'll ask you a few questions, but it'll break it down. But we know that zone 2 heart rate is the most effective at burning fat. Once you get into zone 3, 4, and 5, you're burning more glucose. And so in terms of body composition and weight loss, zone 2 exercise is most beneficial over zone 3, 4, 5. Seems counterintuitive. It seems like if you go out and run as fast as you can for half a mile, that would be more beneficial than going out and just walking at a zone 2 pace where your heart rate's up a little bit, but maybe doing it for a longer period of time. But in fact, the less intense program is better. The continuous endurance training with your heart rate around 65% of its maximum is your best option for body composition for fat loss. I hope this information is useful. It breaks it down nicely into the 5 different types of exercise. And what's really most interesting is that the 2 types of exercise where you have a cardiovascular component and a component of resistance training are the 2 that across the board are number 1 and 2 for health benefits. And those health benefits being body composition, blood lipids, sugar control, blood pressure control, and cardiovascular fitness. So I hope you found this useful. It's a great study. It's worth a read if you're into that. But if not, this is a good synopsis. I just think that when we're trying to figure out the best way to do it, sometimes we get overwhelmed with everything that's out there and all the different options. You can literally find anything you want on the internet. You can find people to tell you that there's nothing bad about a banana, and you can find people to tell you there's nothing good about it. So having a study like this, where it really looks at it scientifically and lays out the information, is incredibly beneficial and helps us to be able to dial in our exercise program and what we need to do to meet our goals. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then.